noted that over the past 25 years, exports from Ghana to Canada have grown dramatically. He claims that from $8.3 million in 1995 to $72.2 million in 2020, Ghana's export to Canada, which include cocoa, rubber, processed fruit, nuts, and aluminium, rose at an annual rate of 9.51%. On the other side, significant imports into Ghana from Canada climbed by 8.97% during the same period, including heat, automobiles, used clothing, excavators, and poultry. The GIPC boss, who was speaking at the opening of the Ghana-Canada Investment Summit in Toronto, Canada, said Ghana is a favorable place for business and investment and pointed out that the nation is rich in resources like gold, manganese, bauxite, and even lithium, with agriculture serving as its backbone and fueling industrialization. In other stories, as part of the directives to the Federal Maritime Commission (FMC) contained in a 3-month-old Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, OSRA 2022, the agency is required to come up with the regulations regarding examination of instances where ocean carriers refuse to engage in conversation with goods shippers regarding booking of cargo. In other words, OSRA 2022's author was saying that the carrier should be held accountable for their refusal to deal. The FMC has now proposed some specific wording and is now in the process of soliciting comment so that it might hear objections and fine-tune the wording. An important question for responders was whether an emergency situation exists that would allow the FMC to require greater transparency on schedules of box movement to be provided by terminals and carriers. The veteran shipping executive John McCorn was one of the many commenters to the FMC in response to its solicitation. In his submission, he opined that an emergency situation does in fact exist that can be measured by any one of a number of factual benchmarks. He added that benchmarks that justifies taking emergency action in the significant inflation in the aggregate cost of shipping product into U.S. in container now compared to before the pandemic. Looking at actual numbers, the McCorn compute by looking at moves into the top 10 U.S. ports were probably underestimates the magnitude of its inflation. He notes that shipping's contribution to inflation is 3.404 times what it was 2 and 1.5 years ago during the last quarter, unaffected by the pandemic. The annualized cost difference is $88.0 billion based on an aggregate shipping cost equivalent to $102.6 billion in 2022 compared to $36.6 billion in Q4 of 2019. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said climate disaster and skyrocketing fuel prices have made the need to end our global addiction to fossil fuel crystal clear. He also underscored the importance of investing in renewables, building resilience, and scaling up adaptation. He said if we had invested massively in renewable energy in the past, we would not be in the middle of a climate emergency now. Renewables are the only credible path to real energy security, stable power prices, and sustainable employment opportunities in the world now. He also maintained that the share of renewables in global electricity generation must increase from nearly 30% today to over 60% in 2030 and 90% in 2050. He has therefore cautioned that leaders in business as well as government must stop thinking about renewable as a distant project of the future, but rather consider it an emergency situation to be pursued. The head of the second biggest United States port expects the pandemic-era surge in consumer demand that snared supply chain will start to cool, with evidence of a deceleration already reflected in weaker inbound container arrivals. Imports into Long Beach have now fallen from 2 months. Meanwhile, the neighboring port of Los Angeles registered the biggest decline in inbound cargo since the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic in August. Together, the twin operations handled about 40% of containerized trade in Asia. The most recent data show U.S. consumer spending and retail sales rising at a sluggish pace, a sign that the hottest inflation in almost 4 decades is starting to take its toll on the economy. Ports had for months been overwhelmed by an influx of goods that triggered supply chain logjam and delivery delays, but that is showing signs of abating due to logistics improvement as interest rate increases are starting to cool demand. Cordero and other U.S. port directors forecast an earlier than normal peak season in July as retailers raced around the clock to avoid another logistics nightmare around the holidays. Despite a cool down in the second half of the year, Long Beach is still set for a strong year. The Long Beach is among 29 ports on the U.S. West Coast awaiting the outcome of labor talks between the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, which represents 220,000 dock workers, and the Pacific Maritime Association negotiating on behalf of more than 70 employers. The employees have been working without a contract since their previous pact expired in July 1st, and both sides have vowed to avoid a repeat of the 2014 negotiations, which resulted in the U.S. facing 9 months of disruption and shipping delays that only ended after the Obama administration intervened. On this note, to wrap up this morning's edition of Maritime and Port News, Maritime and Port News is proudly sponsored by the Ghana Shippers Authority. They provide you with the best in all your shipping solutions. Contact them at the Shippers House in Accra. My name is Nanesi Boateng.